Now, the rest of the story. One of the most exciting developments in the history of marine technology was about to be presented to the United States Navy, an invention, a craft called the HD-4. The principles on which it operated had been conceived earlier in Europe, but it had required the ingenuity and persistence of two men in the New World to make the dream a reality. And the dream was the Hydrofoil, a vessel with a succession of slanted blades attached to its hull, which enabled it to rise above the surface of the water. Because of the decreased resistance of the water, such a boat would be capable of traveling at tremendous speeds. And now, at last, it was within the grasp of the United States Navy in the form of the prototype HD-4. The research and development had been conducted privately in a remote, secluded plant, but finally the project was completed. Navy personnel would have the opportunity to observe the HD-4 in action. The demonstration was exciting and entirely successful. In fact, the HD-4 set a world record for marine travel with the then phenomenal speed of 70.86 miles an hour. And then one of the developers related the rest of the story, that his original intention had been to invent a boat that would rise up out of the water and actually soar in the air, because his true interest, he confessed, was aviation. Well, this came as a surprise to hardly anyone at the time, because he, the co-designer of the HD-4, was actually a pioneer in heavier-than-air flight. I want you to remember that about him. A pioneer in flight. Since boyhood, the subject had fascinated him. He'd made many thousands of related experiments. He'd produced helicopter designs, including one with rockets on the tips of rotor blades. He'd tinkered with innumerable propellers and wings. He had invented the tetrahedral cell. He had also founded the Aerial Experiment Association, responsible for the design and construction and testing of several revolutionary aircraft. His heart was in the sky, and it was he and an AEA colleague who, in attempting to develop a flying boat, conceived of and produced a working hydrofoil, the HD-4. And they presented it to the United States Navy, and the Navy turned it down. Oh, the Navy agreed it worked. But once they had it, what would they do with it? The entire idea was simply too radical for the United States Navy. In 1919... You see, one of those two men who produced the HD-4 was an engineer named Casey Baldwin. I doubt you've heard of him. But the other fellow, the true inspiration for the project, was more of a pioneer in the field of aviation than you ever imagined until this minute. For he was experimenting in that field, aviation, 10 years before the Wright brothers, 10 years before that historic flight at Kitty Hawk. The science of flight was perhaps his most persistent and passionate interest. Yet, because of a little something called the telephone, you have had an entirely different impression of Alexander Graham Bell. But now, well, now you know the rest of the story.
And now the rest of the story. When we think of Alexander Graham Bell, our minds immediately conjure up images of telephones. Depending on your age, it may be an old Bakelite rotary telephone, or it may be the newest cell phone. But there was much more to Alexander Graham Bell than just the telephone. Bell most likely began experimenting in hydrofoil technology in 1906 after reading about William Meacham's experiments with hydrofoils in the March 1906 edition of Scientific American magazine. Now let's break down the meaning of hydrofoil. The word is a combination of hydro plus foil. Hydro relates to water, of course, and foil pertains to a surface such as a wing, which is designed to aid in lifting a craft. A hydrofoil is a wing shape attached to a boat. The foils are shaped like airplane wings in that they are tapered to allow water to flow quickly over them. At higher speeds, this action creates lift. This lifts the boat out of the water and into the air, where there is much less resistance and higher speeds can be reached. You see, when a normal boat moves forward, Most of the energy is expended in moving the water in front of the boat out of the way by pushing or forcing the hull through it. Hydrofoils lift the hull out of the water so that you only have to overcome the drag on the foils instead of all of the drag on the hull. In 1906, Bell began using floats on some tetrahedral kite experiments at his 600-acre estate he called Benbrake, which meant beautiful mountain in Scottish Gaelic. A tetrahedral kite is a multi-sailed, rigid box kite that Bell invented. This is one of the early tetrahedral kites that Bell invented. The most notable feature of a tetrahedral kite is in its many triangles. In inventing the tetrahedral kite, Bell was searching for a way to make a kite that he could scale up large enough to carry both a man and a motor. His goal was powered human flight. In September 1907, a group of engineers and inventors created the Aerial Experiment Association. Bell was the leader of the group. Bell hired Frederick Walker Casey Baldwin, a member of the AEA, as his chief engineer. Later in 1907, Bell scaled up his tetrahedral kite model to one which included a whopping 3,393 cells in a wall-like wing. He called it the Signet model. The Signet was 40 feet long and weighed 200 pounds. On December the 6th, 1907, a steamboat towed the Signet and carried Thomas Selfridge to a height of 168 feet above the water. But the Signet was difficult to control and was destroyed when it hit the water at the end of the flight. Thomas Selfridge was uninjured. Bell was hopeful that the Signet could include an engine. In the following year, the AEA team built a smaller copy of the Signet, which they called Signet II. Engineers added a wheeled undercarriage and a Curtiss V8 engine. Attempts to fly the Signet II failed twice in February 1909. The AEA team built a third model, they called it the Signet III, and it had a more powerful engine. Engineers worked for 3 years on improvements, and in March 1912, John McCurdy tested the Signet III, but it only lifted off the ground a foot or two. During a final test, the tetrahedral cell bank collapsed. Bell and the other engineers determined that the Signet design was a complete failure. In 1913, Bell hired Walter Pinode, a yacht builder, to work on the pontoons for an experimental boat they called the Hydrodome. After 3 redesigns, they built HD-4, which stood for Hydrodome 4. Built of wood with steel fittings, the HD-4 was 60 feet long overall and was powered originally by 2 250 horsepower Renault engines, later replaced by 2 360 horsepower Liberty engines. September 9, 1919, Bell, Casey, and other engineers from the AEA, along with some Navy brass, gathered at Cape Breton to test the Hydrodome. As they watched, the boat sped through the water and the hull rose 3 feet out of the water. HD-4 speed increased to 70.86 miles per hour and achieved the world record for the maximum speed of a watercraft. The Navy men were there to see if HD-4 could be used to fire torpedoes. They wanted to know if HD-4 could still lift itself out of the water while carrying heavy torpedoes. At their request, Bell had HD-4 loaded with 3,000 pounds of pig lead and ran the boat again. It performed brilliantly and could easily have carried more weight, but they didn't push it. The Navy men were impressed, but HD-4 had only been tested in calm water. They wanted to know how it would perform in rough water on the open sea. Bell had his men run HD-4 in the choppy, white-capped sea. While other boats in the area were pounded by the sea, HD-4's hull rose so high out of the water that the waves were unable to reach it. HD-4 glided through the rough water as smoothly as an airplane in calm skies. The Navy ultimately passed on Bell's hydrofoil. But that wasn't the end of hydrofoil watercraft. There are numerous boats, yachts, sailboats, and jet skis, which all use hydrofoil technology based on Bell's original designs. And the technology has been adapted for hydrofoil surfing, skiing, and with a sit-down contraption called the air chair. The Navy certainly didn't give up on the hydrofoil. In April 2019, a new top-secret Navy hydrofoil project was accidentally revealed in a YouTube video, but that video has since been removed. Alexander Graham Bell will always be associated with the telephone, but he also invented other things that we're familiar with, such as metal detectors. He invented the first metal detector to locate a bullet inside of President James Garfield following his assassination. The photophone, which allowed the transmission of speech over a beam of light. The graphophone, which was an improved version of the phonograph that could record and play back sound. Bell once said, "The inventor looks upon the world and is not contented with things as they are. He wants to improve whatever he sees. He wants to benefit the world. He is haunted by an idea. The spirit of invention possesses him, seeking materialization." The only difference between success and failure is the ability to take action. So if you have an idea for an invention, be sure to take action. You might just change the world as Alexander Graham Bell did. I'm Brad Dison. Thanks for watching. And now you know the rest of the story.